Welcome to Zoe Stories. Living in luxury after becoming his daughter, Jason had never imagined his life would take such a turn. Growing up in a small, run-down apartment, the dream of luxury felt as far away as the stars. His father was never in the picture, and his mother worked long hours at a local diner just to scrape by. Jason had grown accustomed to a life of struggle, but he harbored one secret hope. Someday, he would escape this life of mediocrity. When Jason turned 18, everything changed. He was living with his best friend, Leo, when the letter arrived. It was an official-looking envelope, marked with a crest he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter informing him of the death of a wealthy man, someone who Jason had never known. The letter claimed that the man, Charles Montgomery, had been his biological father. Jason's heart skipped a beat as the words sunk in. According to the letter, Jason was the sole heir to Montgomery's vast estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. The shock hit him like a tidal wave. How could this be real? Jason had always thought of himself as a nobody, but now it seemed he was someone important. His heart raced with anticipation. He had always dreamed of wealth, of a life free from struggle, but the idea of suddenly inheriting such a life felt surreal. Confused but intrigued, Jason went to the mansion. Upon his arrival, the grandeur of the estate took his breath away. Tall iron gates opened, revealing an enormous estate with pristine gardens, marble fountains, and towering columns. Inside, everything was opulent: glittering chandeliers, elegant furniture, and walls lined with priceless paintings. But what stunned him even more was what came next. The will stated that he wasn't just inheriting the money, he was also to assume the role of Montgomery's daughter, living as if he had been raised in the lap of luxury his entire life. This would be his new identity, one he had never asked for, but one he was now bound to. Jason's head spun with questions. How could a simple man like him transition into such an affluent and complicated life? But the will was clear. There was no turning back now. The challenge ahead was far greater than Jason had ever imagined. He was about to enter a world that was both foreign and captivating, and this new identity would bring both unimaginable privileges and profound internal conflict. The first few days in the mansion were a blur of overwhelming opulence and alien rituals. Jason found himself lost in a world he had never dreamed of, surrounded by servants, lavish parties, and an ever-expanding roster of new family members, none of whom seemed to know him. His presence, though unexpected, was an unavoidable fact, and every moment felt like a constant reminder of his sudden new life. But everything changed the moment he met Evelyn. She was the woman who had been Montgomery's closest confidant, the one who ran the estate with an iron grip. Tall, poised, and impossibly elegant, Evelyn exuded an air of authority that Jason felt he could never match. She was the one who greeted him upon his arrival, explaining the complex intricacies of the mansion's life, the family's history, and the expectations that came with his new identity. At first, she had been kind, perhaps even a little distant. But as Jason spent more time in the mansion, he realized there was more to Evelyn than just a controlling figure in his new life. She was the person who had the most control over the household, and as Jason struggled to adjust to his new identity, she made it clear that his success in this new life depended heavily on her approval. It was in the midst of a formal gathering, a dinner party filled with high society elites, that the full weight of the transformation dawned on him. The mansion was filled with guests, all in formal attire, speaking in hushed tones about Jason's sudden arrival. They treated him with polite curiosity, but barely disguised judgment. In their eyes, he was nothing more than an outsider, a young man who had been thrust into a world of wealth and privilege he didn't belong in. That night, Evelyn sat next to him, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the room. "Do you understand now, Jason?" she asked softly, her voice laced with subtle authority. Jason turned to her, feeling a mix of anxiety and confusion. "Understand what?" "The role you now play. Your father may be gone, but this estate still requires someone to carry his legacy, someone who can uphold the family's name. You're not just here to collect a fortune. You're expected to be someone else, someone the world can admire and respect." And if you fail, she let the sentence hang in the air, a challenge Jason could feel settle deep within him. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known that the world of the wealthy operated on different rules, but Evelyn's words made it clear that this wasn't just about wealth. This was a world where appearances, power, and identity could be manipulated, and he was caught right in the middle of it. The evening was filled with delicate conversations, but Jason couldn't focus on anything but Evelyn's warning. What was he supposed to do with this new life? He had never been prepared to inherit not just the fortune, but the expectations of this new persona, the role of a daughter to a man he never knew, in a world that seemed utterly foreign. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at him, something he couldn't quite shake. Would he ever be able to live up to the name Montgomery? Or was he doomed to be a fake in a mansion full of true heirs? Days turned into weeks, and Jason's transformation began to take root more than he ever anticipated. The mansion, vast and cold, seemed to swallow him up, its walls adorned with portraits of generations that came before him, each one staring down, disapproving. The staff, once distant, had now accepted him as part of the household, though he could feel their scrutinizing eyes on him every time he passed by. It was as if they were waiting for him to slip up, to fail in becoming what they expected. He could sense their judgment in every greeting, every motion they made when addressing him, their silence louder than words. But it wasn't just the mansion's inhabitants who kept a watchful eye on him. Evelyn, with her unwavering composure, was ever present, appearing at the most unexpected moments, always guiding Jason toward his next steps, making sure he embraced his new identity. She became both his teacher and his shadow, always pushing, always reminding him of the expectations placed on him. "Remember," she would say, her voice calm but insistent, "you're not just a guest here. You are the daughter of Montgomery. Your actions now reflect his legacy. Every decision you make, every word you speak, will shape how others view you." At first, Jason struggled to keep up with her demands. He had been a young man, before this strange turn of fate. He had known how to live life on his own terms, to make choices free of judgment. But now, he was forced to adopt a role he didn't understand, one that seemed like a mask he could never quite put on perfectly. One of his first lessons was the art of socializing in this rarefied world. Evelyn arranged for him to attend a series of high-profile events, galas, and intimate gatherings, occasions where he was to present himself as a poised, graceful figure, every inch the heiress to a fortune. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, even the way he moved, everything had to be perfect. It was at one of these galas that Jason's sense of identity began to crack. He stood in front of a mirror, wearing a sleek, designer gown that felt so foreign to his own skin. His reflection stared back at him, feminine, poised, but empty. He didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Her blonde hair cascaded around her shoulders, her makeup was flawless, and her posture was that of someone who had lived in wealth and luxury all her life. But beneath the polished exterior, Jason felt only confusion. He didn't feel like the person he used to be. This woman, this new identity, wasn't something he chose, it was something he was forced to become. Evelyn's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you ready? You've got this." Jason didn't respond right away. He didn't know if he had this. Was he really ready to step into the life of someone he wasn't? The life of someone who was expected to maintain grace under pressure, charm everyone she met, and never once let anyone see the cracks? As the gala began, Jason's unease intensified. He was introduced to countless faces, all of them wealthy, influential, and utterly indifferent to his true identity. To them, he was just another heir, another piece of the Montgomery legacy to be paraded and admired. But something in Jason snapped. The more he played the part of a daughter, of a woman, the more he realized how deep the deception ran. He felt like a puppet, strings pulled by Evelyn, by the world around him. Was this all he was now? A beautiful, helpless figure that existed for the benefit of others? Every interaction felt like a performance. As the evening progressed, Jason met Richard Montgomery, a distant relative and a key player in the family business. Richard was intrigued by Jason's sudden reappearance in the family, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. There was a coldness in his demeanor, and Jason could feel the weight of judgment on him. Richard wasn't fooled. "You've changed," Richard said bluntly, his gaze piercing. "You're not the same. You've let the world shape you." Jason froze, unsure of how to respond. He knew what Richard meant. The old Jason was buried, replaced by this new, feminine figure. And though he had tried to convince himself that this was just temporary, just part of the process, he could feel the truth creeping in. This transformation, forced or not, was becoming his reality. Evelyn appeared beside them, sensing the tension. She placed a hand gently on Jason's arm. "Don't mind Richard," she said with a soft smile. "He's just trying to make sure you're up to the task. The world is watching, but you're stronger than you think." Jason's thoughts raced. Was he strong enough to continue pretending, to live this lie every day, to live as someone he no longer recognized? Evelyn's influence loomed large over him, but could he ever truly accept this new identity? Could he really embrace the woman he had become? Or was it all just too much? The doubt in his mind grew, and with it, the realization that the next steps in his journey would require more than just pretending. It would require him to confront the part of him that had been lost and perhaps never truly existed at all. The evening that would mark the turning point in Jason's transformation arrived unexpectedly. It wasn't a gala or a dinner, but a family gathering, a Montgomery tradition. The estate had been filled with the usual suspects, distant relatives, business partners, and key players in the family's empire. Jason had been preparing for days, getting into the perfect mental space to present himself once again as the ideal heiress. Evelyn had been insistent, ensuring everything was in place. But as the night wore on, something shifted within Jason. The weight of his disguise, his mask, felt unbearable. The performances, the endless charades, had begun to erode his sense of self. As he stood by the grand fireplace, mingling with distant cousins, he found himself lost in thought. A part of him, a deep, hidden part, wanted to scream, to run away, to tear off the makeup and the dress and demand to be seen as himself once again. But that part of him had been drowned out by the powerful expectations of the family, by Evelyn's unyielding guidance. Richard Montgomery, ever the skeptic, had been observing Jason from a distance all evening. His piercing eyes seemed to see through the facade. As the night progressed, Jason felt the pressure building, the suffocating realization that he had lost control of his own narrative. Richard approached him, his expression unreadable, but there was something almost predatory in his gaze. "You know," Richard said, his voice low, "this is getting old. You're not fooling anyone, you know." Jason's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" he forced out, his voice trembling. "You've been playing this part for weeks now," Richard continued, his voice dripping with cynicism. "But there's something off. You're not her. You can pretend all you want, but I can see through the act." Jason's mind raced, panic setting in. He wanted to protest, to deny it all, but the truth was undeniable. Was he just pretending? Or had he really become the woman Evelyn had shaped him into? The weight of Richard's words hit Jason harder than he expected. It wasn't just his family legacy that was at stake. It was his entire sense of identity. What was left of the man he had once been? Was he doomed to remain trapped in this gilded cage forever? Evelyn, who had been watching from across the room, suddenly appeared at Jason's side, sensing the tension. "Richard," she said, her voice calm yet firm, "you need to understand. Jason is adapting to his new role. This is about his future and the family name." Richard wasn't convinced, his skepticism only growing. "I'm not blind, Evelyn. He's not who he's pretending to be. And deep down, he knows it." Jason stood frozen, feeling like the walls of the mansion were closing in on him. The grandiose ballroom, once a symbol of power and wealth, now felt suffocating, its opulence a reminder of the life he could never fully embrace. The realization was as sharp as a blade. His new identity, the life he was being pushed into, could never truly be his. No matter how hard he tried, the lie would always be exposed. For a brief moment, Jason thought of running away, of tearing himself from this reality and reclaiming his old life, whatever that might have been. But the thought was fleeting, replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Was there any escaping this transformation now? Evelyn seemed to sense Jason's inner turmoil, her calm demeanor now replaced with an edge of something darker. "You can't go back, Jason," she said quietly, her words carrying an ominous weight. "You belong to this family now, whether you like it or not. You've already made your choice." Her words struck Jason like a blow, but it wasn't just the weight of her authority that kept him frozen in place. It was the truth behind them. He had chosen this life when he stepped into the mansion's grand halls. He had chosen to become her, to become Montgomery's daughter, to play the part. And now it was too late to turn back. But Jason wasn't sure anymore if he could live with that choice. The woman he had become, the role he was forced to play, had started to consume him, body and soul. Would he ever be able to find himself again, or had he already lost everything in his search for acceptance? As Richard's cold gaze bore into him, Jason realized that the real transformation had already taken place, not in his appearance, but in his mind and heart. Evelyn had won. She had molded him into the perfect heir to the Montgomery legacy. But in doing so, she had erased everything that made him who he was. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Jason. The weight of Richard's words lingered in the air, suffocating every moment, and the warm, elegant hum of the party became a distant murmur in his ears. Evelyn had taken charge, as always, guiding him through the motions, smiling at the right moments, engaging in conversation with guests, and playing her part as the doting mother to her transformed daughter. But Jason felt different now. He wasn't playing a role anymore. He was living a nightmare, unable to escape the labyrinth of expectations and identity traps that Evelyn had constructed for him. The mirror he had once admired for showing his reflection as her daughter now felt like a cruel trick, a mockery of who he had been and who he still longed to be. As the night wore on, the guests slowly began to filter out, their laughter fading into the night. The grand mansion seemed quieter now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Evelyn remained by his side, always watching, always vigilant, as if sensing the inner turmoil bubbling beneath Jason's composed exterior. She had seen it before, the moment when her creations began to question their place in her world. She was not about to lose him now. When the last of the guests had left, and the sprawling halls were once again empty, Jason found himself alone with her in the drawing room. The weight of her gaze made him feel small, fragile. "You did well tonight," Evelyn said softly, her tone almost too sweet. "You know your place now, don't you?" Jason's heart pounded, but he said nothing. The question wasn't really for him, it was more of a statement. She already knew the answer. Evelyn continued, her voice lowering with an edge of possessiveness. "I've given you everything. This life, this name, this future. You were nothing before, Jason. But now, look at you. You have everything a woman could dream of. Power, wealth, respect." Jason's thoughts raced. Yes, she had given him all of those things. But at what cost? What was left of him? Was this all there was? A gilded cage, beautiful but suffocating, in which he could never truly be himself. His throat tightened as he tried to speak. I don't know who I am anymore, Evelyn. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Her eyes narrowed, the smile fading from her lips.
"Don't be foolish," she snapped.
"You've made your choice. You belong to this family now. And you will play your part, just like I've taught you. There's no turning back. Not now. Not ever." For the first time since this all began, Jason felt the icy grip of fear squeeze his chest. Was she right? Was there truly no way out? No hope of reclaiming his own identity? The life he had built, step by step, was slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But something deep inside him, a flicker of resistance, refused to die. A part of him, the part he'd buried so deep, wanted to shout out, to demand freedom, to reclaim the person he had once been. Even if it meant destroying the facade Evelyn had so carefully crafted. The confrontation was inevitable, and it was now. Jason turned away from her, his voice shaky but resolute. "I can't do this anymore, Evelyn. I'm not her. I'm not your daughter. I can't live this lie. Not for one more day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Evelyn's face twisted with anger and disbelief. She took a step toward him, her heels clicking on the marble floor, but Jason stood his ground. "You ungrateful little," she began, but Jason held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice stronger now. "But I can't be the woman you want me to be. I need to find myself again. Before it's too late." For a long moment, there was silence. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock, and then slowly, as if all the fight had drained from her, she let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you can escape, don't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with both sadness and malice. "You have nothing left to go back to. No family, no future. You'll never make it on your own." Jason didn't flinch. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside him. Hope, however small. "I'll find a way," he said, his voice firm. And with that, he turned and walked away from her, out of the drawing room, through the grand halls, and into the night. The mansion, his cage, faded behind him. He didn't know where the road would lead, but he knew this. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life, and no one, least of all Evelyn, could stop him now. The night was colder than Jason expected. As he stepped out of the mansion, his heels clicking against the cold pavement, the silence felt heavy, yet somehow liberating. The sharp scent of fresh air filled his lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere he had just left behind. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As he walked farther away from the mansion, Jason's thoughts spiraled. He didn't know what the future held, but he was no longer running from it. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of control. His heart wasn't beating in fear of what Evelyn might do next, but in the anticipation of what he might be able to do for himself. His mind raced through the possibilities. Without the constraints of the life Evelyn had built for him, what would he even do? Who was he now if he wasn't her daughter, if he wasn't the woman she had forced him to become? Jason didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't go back to that gilded cage. The world outside seemed vast and unfamiliar, but there was something exhilarating about it. The idea that he could carve out his own path, despite all the odds, filled him with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Maybe he could find a way to be himself again, even if it meant starting from nothing. After several blocks, Jason realized he wasn't just walking away from Evelyn, but from everything he had been told he was supposed to be. He passed storefronts, people huddled in their own worlds, and for the first time, he noticed the details, the small moments of life happening around him. He felt human again. A small voice in his head whispered doubts, asking him if he was strong enough to navigate this new world without the luxury, the wealth, and the safety Evelyn had provided. But Jason didn't let those thoughts hold him back. He had made it this far. He was stronger than he thought. He wasn't alone after all. There were people out there who understood, who accepted the parts of him that Evelyn had tried to erase. He checked his phone, and for the first time in weeks, there was a message from a number he didn't recognize. "Jason, I've been thinking. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." It was a message from someone who had known him before everything changed, an old friend who had always been kind, supportive, and real. Jason smiled to himself. This was a sign. Reminder that there were still connections worth exploring. There were still possibilities beyond the walls of Evelyn's world. Jason paused in front of a small cafe, the warm light from the inside spilling out into the dark street. He stood there for a moment, hesitating. But then he opened the door and stepped inside, the soft bell above ringing a small chime. The warmth of the place wrapped around him like a blanket, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax. As he approached the counter, the barista greeted him with a smile. "What can I get for you?" Jason looked at the menu, the words a blur as he thought about what he had left behind and what he could now rebuild. He ordered a coffee, something simple yet grounding. The barista handed him the drink with a cheerful nod, and as Jason took the cup, he realized something important. This moment, this seemingly insignificant decision, was his own. He was in control now, not Evelyn, not anyone else. He wasn't sure how long it would take to untangle the mess he had made of his life, but he now knew that he had the strength to try. One small step at a time. Jason's journey was just beginning, and whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. This was his second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Thank you for joining us on another captivating journey through Zoe's stories. Remember to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale. Until next time, keep exploring, keep imagining, and keep believing in the magic of storytelling. See you in the next chapter.